The Pope's Final Message, Volume 2, Revelation and Rebellion, by P.J. Gott and Logan Light. Author's Note: The Luke Josephus Codex Hypothesis. This research-based historical novel, a trilogy, proposes that the Gospel of Luke, the Jewish War by Josephus, and the Lives of Caesar and Antony by Plutarch were composed collaboratively around 70 to 71 CE as part of a covert literary preservation effort initiated by Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, here portrayed as still alive under identities they invented to reveal the purpose of their project. Gamaliel, Gamma El Ella, translated God, Goddess Within, and Philo, translated Love. According to this hypothesis, they convened in Vespasian's palace with their sons, Lucius the Niger, also known as Plutarch, Tiberius Julius Alexander, also known as Pliny the Elder, Paul's son, Joseph Barnabas, also known as Josephus, and Livy's son Titus, to encode suppressed Nazarene theology and historical truth hidden within layered midrash, symbolic narrative, and veiled allegory. Their mission was to resist the rising influence of Paul's theology, which had recast Jesus the Nazarene as Jesus from Nazareth, and replaced the feminine-rooted ethic of Hillel, do unto others, with a doctrine of vicarious atonement. This hypothesis asserts that these collaborators embedded secret lineages, divine titles, and feminine deities into canonical and classical works through enigmatic names, for example, Dynamis for Cleopatra, Hillel for Julius Caesar, symbolic rewritings, for example, the Star of Bethlehem as a coded celestial marker, and character renamings, for example, Philos as a female disguised as a man who taught Pythagorean exegesis. The Luke Josephus Codex theory challenges traditional dating and authorship of Luke Acts, Josephus's histories, and Plutarch's biographies by interpreting them as components of a single coordinated literary effort. It aligns with Philo's allegorical method and asserts that later insertions and mistranslations, especially in Greek-speaking Christian communities, obscured the original Hebrew and Aramaic enigmas meant to preserve the Nazarene lineage and the feminine divine. This project blends historical reconstruction with literary decoding and proposes a radical recentering of the mother, daughter, and true Son of God within the suppressed Nazarene tradition that predates and challenges what later came to be called Christianity. This book is a work of fiction. While it draws on historical figures, locations, and texts, the events, conversations, and characterizations are products of the author's imagination and interpretive research. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is either coincidental or part of an intentional fictional reconstruction meant to challenge traditional narratives. The story is not intended as a historical record, but as a work of literary interpretation exploring suppressed or alternative possibilities. Copyright 2025 by P.J. Gott, all rights reserved. Chapter 1, The Return. Santa Fe Airport, August 9, 2024. The private jet touched down just as the desert sun began its descent behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The shadows stretched long across the tarmac. The ochre-pink sky cast a familiar glow over the landscape Pamela and Lia had longed for without fully knowing it, a landscape that had pulled at their hearts long before they knew why. The cabin door opened with a hiss. Pamela stepped out first into the dry, high desert air. Behind her, Lia paused at the top of the stairs, breathing in the scent of sagebrush carried on the breeze, her chest raising with a slow, grateful breath. Then came the sound, two high-pitched barks, followed by a deeper, steadier one. Joe stood just beyond the security gate, waving both arms overhead. Beside him, the dogs had already broken free. Lucas tore across the pavement in bounding loops of joy, while Peanut trotted with purpose and unmistakable pride. "Lucas!" Pamela dropped her bag and knelt as he launched into her arms, tail thumping wildly against her legs. Peanut, chest puffed out, came straight to Lia. He paused, assessing, then rose on his hind legs to give her one formal kiss on the hand. "Well," Lia said with a smile, "a proper gentleman." Joe arrived moments later, his eyes shining. "Welcome home," he said, embracing Pamela first, then Lia, with warmth that only deepened the sense of return. "These two haven't stopped pacing since you left," Joe added, scratching behind Lucas's ear. "Neither have we," Lia replied, brushing wind-blown hair from her face. As they gathered their bags, Joe opened the SUV's rear hatch and began loading the bags. Lucas hopped into the back seat without being told, spinning once before settling in. Peanut took his place on the armrest, looking out like a dignitary surveying his lands. Pamela turned to Joe as they loaded the last bag into the car. Just a heads up, Leah's going to be around a lot. We made a decision on the plane. We're going to write the book, the one Francis entrusted to us. Joe raised an eyebrow, then smiled gently. Good. You won't have to carry it alone. Pamela glanced at Leah, who simply nodded, her hand resting over her heart. We promised him, Leah said softly. Pamela exhaled, the fatigue of the journey finally giving way to something steadier. Purpose. Tomorrow I want to take you to Rancho de Taos. You need to see St. Francis's Church, not for religion, for presence, ambiance. Something about that place. Leah's smile was quiet, assured. Lead the way. Joe gave the door a final click shut and slid into the driver's seat. As they pulled into the lavender dusk, headlights sweeping the road ahead, none of them spoke. They didn't need to. The next chapter had already begun. Chapter 2. Pilgrimage to the Unburied. Highway to Rancho de Taos, August 10th, 2024. The desert unfurled in muted golds and sage green, broken only by weathered fence lines and the shadow of a lone raven gliding low. The road south of Espanola had always felt like a corridor between worlds, earthy, timeless, and unnervingly still. In the distance, dust devils twisted through the sagebrush like restless ghosts searching for home. Leah tapped the open notebook. Listen to this. Santa Fe was founded in 1610 by the Spanish. Its full name was La Villa Real de la Santa Fe de San Francisco de Asís, the royal town of the Holy Faith of St. Francis of Assisi. Pamela glanced sideways, one hand draped over the wheel. So Fe is faith, not a woman's name? Leah smiled. Exactly. And St. Francis was chosen as the city's patron. These Franciscans built the first church here, same name as the one we're visiting. Completed in 1815, Pamela said, adding, and still standing after all this time. Leah flipped another page. The first recorded Mass in Santa Fe was celebrated in June 1610 by Fray Alonso de Benavides. Franciscan? Yeah, he oversaw conversion campaigns across New Mexico, pueblos mostly. Pamela's hand tightened around the wheel. Her voice sharpened. Just like Paul, erasing an ancient tradition and replacing it with his own. Just like he buried the way of the Nazarenes under Christian theology. They drove a moment in silence, the hum of tires against the blacktop a steady undercurrent. Leah closed the notebook. Makes you wonder what the land remembers. Pamela's eyes narrowed toward the distant silhouette of Wheeler Peak, rising out of the high desert. I think, she said softly, it remembers everything. The adobe silhouette of the Church of St. Francis of Assisi emerged like a vision from the golden dust of the high desert. Its smooth earthen walls, broad and rounded with age and layer upon layer of adobe, reflected the sunlight in soft, radiant hues. The structure seemed less like it was built and more like it had risen from the ground itself, a sacred hill molded by centuries of prayer. Pamela pulled the car into the gravel lot across from the church. She turned off the engine and leaned back for a moment, letting the silence settle. Beside her, Leah stared out through the windshield. Just look at it, Pamela whispered. The most photographed church in North America, but it's not about the pictures. It feels ancient, Leah said quietly, like it's been waiting. They stepped out into the crisp New Mexico air, the sky impossibly blue above them. The scent of sage and wood smoke drifted on a faint breeze. The silence wasn't empty, it was full, alive, pressing gently against their skin. As they walked toward the church's iconic rear facade, rounded, sculptural, monastic, Leah brushed her hand along the adobe wall. Pamela glanced at her. Francis of Assisi was the safest symbol they could find, she said. Gentle, obedient, peaceful. So they used his name to baptize conquest. Santa Fe, Leah murmured. Holy faith. Bishop Tamron named it. 18th century. Sent by the Spanish crown to evaluate the missions. He consecrated the region under St. Francis and the so-called True Faith. They rounded the church to the front entrance. The twin bell towers cast long shadows on the sun-baked ground. A wooden door, weathered and carved, stood between them. "He's always holding animals in the ark," Lia said, tilting her head at the painted St. Francis above the entrance. "A lamb, a dove." "He spoke to birds," Pamela said. "But he also refused power, gave everything away, loved the earth. That's why they had to co-opt him." Lia paused. "Just like Paul. Took the stories of a Nazarene prophet who honored women, protected the poor, and twisted it into a theology of obedience to male superiority and sacrifice." Pamela nodded grimly. "Exactly. They remembered his humility, but used it to hide their violence." They stepped inside. Cool air greeted them like a breath from another world. The thick adobe walls muffled all sound. Light filtered in through small windows, touching everything: altar, wooden beams, candles, plaster, with reverent softness. Lia walked slowly to a pew near the center. She sat, then opened her notebook and let her pen rest on the page. As Pamela sat down beside her, she whispered, "This is where it started, the beginning of the unburying." Lia touched her hand. "And this marks the beginning of the revelation, the revolution, the resurrection of their love into the light." Pamela shifted to drive and pulled onto the street, heading north instead of south. "I can't be this close to Arroyo Seco without getting Joe some of Abe's burritos and tamales. Best burrito in New Mexico." She looked at Lia. "We're still in time for lunch, and you're going to love it." Lia smiled. "So we're food pilgrims now. And delivery service." The road curved north out of Taos, tracing the gentle rise of the Sangre de Cristo foothills. Juniper and pinyon flanked the pavement. Small patches of snow could still be seen clinging to the distant peaks, hiding in the shade out of reach of the summer sun. "We'll do a little shopping after lunch," Pamela said, turning off the road into a dusty lot in front of a modest adobe storefront. "I occasionally find a piece of pottery I can't resist in the shop across the street." A faded sign over the door read, "Abe's Cantina and Cocina." A blue door, its edges worn pale by years of sun and wind, stood beneath the faded sign, a green chili ristra swinging lazily from its hook. Inside, the scent of roasted green chili hit them with full force. Locals sat at heavy wooden tables, sipping horchata and laughing under strings of old Christmas lights. The walls were cluttered with dusty cowboy hats, snapshots from decades past, and yellowed newspaper clippings. Abe was behind the bar, humming along to an old corrido drifting from the radio. He looked up and grinned as they walked in. "Pamela, been a while. Lena's Burritos finally called you home?" "You know it," she said, smiling, "and I need one to go for Joe." She gestured to her companion. "This is my friend Lia. Believe it or not, she's lived in Santa Fe nearly 20 years and has never been here." Abe raised an eyebrow, then nodded warmly. "Well, welcome, Lia. You're in for a treat." He slid 2 menus and glasses of water onto the bar. "Sit wherever you like." They ordered burritos smothered in green chili and sat by a window overlooking the distant peaks. "Was Francis here?" Lia asked playfully, tearing into her tortilla. "If he was, he'd have ditched the church and started a chili farm," Pamela said. "Look at this, Holy Communion with cheese." As they ate, the mood grew quieter. Pamela stirred her beans. "Before we get too deep in the book, I need you to be sure." Lia looked up. Pamela continued. "If we do this, if we tell the story we've uncovered, we're going to face backlash. Serious backlash, not just scholars. People who see women as dangerous." Lia nodded. "I know. Like the one who wants to reinstate Salem-like witch trials. If Polycarp risked everything to protect the truth, what are we doing if we stay quiet?" Pamela smiled, her eyes soft. "Then we'll start where he left off." Outside, the desert light shifted, golden and glowing. The mountains watched in silence as 2 women finished their lunch and prepared to rewrite what had long been buried. The sun dipped low behind the Jemez Mountains, casting long shadows across the high desert as a car hummed south along the winding road. The light through the windshield warmed Leah's face, and a comfortable silence settled between the 2 women. Stomachs full, hearts fuller. That was everything I needed, Leah said softly, watching golden grasses blur past her window. Pamela smiled without taking her eyes off the road. It always is. That little church, Abe's Burritos. Something about it reminds you what matters. They reached Santa Fe just as twilight set the Sangre de Cristos on fire. The tires crunched up the gravel drive as Pamela pulled in and cut the engine. The porch light flicked on before they reached the front steps. Joe opened the door. "You're back," he said, grinning. "Everything go okay?" Pamela nodded and handed him the barely warm brown sack from Abe's. Burritos and tamales. Joe's eyes lit up. "You went to Abe's without me?" "Pilgrimage," Leah teased. "Strictly spiritual." Inside, the comforting smells of home welcomed them. Cedar, old books, coffee. Lucas skittered into the foyer first. Peanut wasn't far behind, tail wagging furiously. Joe looked at Pamela with mock sternness. "They know the smell. Did you bring 'em anything?" Pamela bent down and unwrapped a foil bundle, tearing off a corner of tamale and burrito. Of course, tiny miracles for tiny saints. She placed their portions on saucers as Lucas sat, alert and polite, and Peanut did a little spin of joy. Leah grabbed her bag. "I'll head home for tonight. Let everything settle. But tomorrow we start." Pamela met her gaze. "We do." Joe slipped an arm around Pamela's shoulders as they stood in the open doorway watching Leah disappear into the deepening blue of night. "How about a cup of tea before we go to bed?" he said. "I have something to show you." He had encouraged Pamela in her quest for the historical Jesus, but from a respectful distance. Now, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea, he handed her a printed summary of an AI response to a question. "I asked my AI friend what she thinks about your work. You want to hear what she said?" Pamela smiled. "Only if it says I'm right." Joe chuckled. "According to the algorithm, your hypothesis ranks as the most likely explanation for the historical Jesus." He stopped to emphasize. "Number one." He pointed at the printout and read from it. "Your synthesis of archaeological evidence, allegorical readings, and the Nazarene priesthood tradition offers a stronger foundation than apocalyptic prophet theories or mythicists' views." "Seriously?" Joe held up the page. "AI calls it the most coherent and comprehensive hypothesis, especially when you apply Philo's method. That sealed it." Pamela crossed her arms, grinning. "Told you." Lucas and Peanut, always aware of treat times, jumped on Joe's leg in a coordinated ritual. He glanced at the clock. "How do they know it's time for Betty Bye cheese?" "I have no idea," she smiled. "Ask our AI friend." Outside, the stars were beginning to show. Ancient lights over a land still listening.